I'm sure you've heard that there is a buildup of soldiers, Russian soldiers, tanks, artillery, and the like on the Russian border near Ukraine. I'm sure you've heard that there is continued fear that the Ukraine will be invaded by Russia. I'm sure you've heard Biden's statements on this. I want to talk about this, but I want to take a step back. Is it true that there has been some, Russian involvement in Ukraine in the past couple of years? Yeah, there is. I'm not denying that. I don't think that's questionable at all. I mean, Russia denies it, but I think it's very likely that they have been involved in some way. And even if they didn't send money, soldiers, or weapons, they didn't say no, right? I mean, so I think that Russia has some involvement in what's been going on in Ukraine the last couple of years. Again, also not what I'm here to talk about. What I want to talk about is the history concerning Russian aggression and Europe and their defensiveness, as it were. By the way, this references a discussion I had a while ago concerning NATO and why we should get rid of it. So if you missed that, it is on YouTube. Please give it a listen. It will inform the conversation that we're going to have right now. So, as you all know from my previous discussions, NATO is a hostile organization towards Russia. It always has been. It is likely always going to be. And Russia has their own local defense organization. I don't remember exactly what it's called. CETO. I don't remember the wording for it. But anyway, they have their own now. And Russia and Europe have been in a back and forth for a very long time. So it's true that Europe promised the Russians that there would be no further expansion of NATO in the direction of Russia, and that has obviously been a lie. NATO has been slowly and steadily expanding its membership eastward, much to the dismay of Russia, who sees NATO rightfully as a hostile organization. I don't even want to just talk about that. I want to go way, way back. Russia and Europe have actually had antagonistic relationships for hundreds of years, all the way back to Catherine the Great. So, by the way, part of this had to do with around the Industrial Revolution, Russia had access to a lot of raw resources that Europe wanted. It also had access to the northern sea routes. So things were a little different then because it was more difficult to get from east to west. But one of the reasons that the Suez Canal became so important to the British Empire was because they didn't want to have to deal with Russia and trying to go north to get to Asia. Whereas Russia, for limited portions throughout the year, was able to control a very valuable trade route that went north of Russia that could take you from Europe to Asia, right? And this was very valuable because for hundreds of years, Europeans have been trying to get spices, China, and other items from the East, right? The purpose of the Silk Road. Literally, this goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. But at the turn of the Industrial Revolution, Russia had access to two very important resources. They had huge deposits of coal, and they had tons and tons and tons of trees. And Russia was actually doing really well as an exporter of coal and lumber, but they were also using a lot of their resources internally to make the country a better place. One of the reasons Peter the Great is the Great and Catherine the Great is the Great is because they were able to successfully use the resources of the Russian state to create prosperity in Russia. And by the way, Russia at this point spans the entirety of its more or less modern borders. And the Russian Empire is all this. During that time and before World War I, the Britain and the US invaded Russia from the south in order to secure Russian resources. So there has been a back and forth going on between Russia and and Europe, now the EU, and America for a very long time. Now, the motivations for this have changed over the years, and Russia has altered its strategy for how it deals with Europe over the years, some Russian rulers were content to try and trade with Europe and gain prosperity through mutual trade and understanding. Peter the Great is one of those. And some rulers looked at Europe and saw saw a group of hostile actors who wanted Russian resources and were not willing to allow Russia to share in that prosperity. And in some ways, they were very right about that. But as you advance onto the history between Europe and Russia, these angles have kind of bashed up against each other. First, it was wood, then it was coal, and then it was oil. Russia has access to the Crimean Mountains, and there are oil reserves there. Russia has been able to use those oil reserves to control some level of economic prosperity into Europe. But by the way, Russia didn't just come up with that position because they felt like being aggro at Europe one day, right? As I had mentioned, this antagonistic relationship literally goes back hundreds of years. And there has never been any sort of reparations or any sort of reconciliation between Russia and what we now call the West. And by the way, the West is a totally mythical concept, more or less anyway. But there hasn't been an active attempt to bring Russia into the fold for real. Countries ask Russia for things when they need them, but they're not about trying to maintain a happy long-term relationship with Russia. And actually, at this point, it might be too late because we have been antagonistic to Russia for so long. And the Cold War, by the way, was an absolute mess. The types of things that we did to Russia and the things that Russia did to us and the proxy wars that were fought and the creation of the Third World, which I explained on a previous show, but is essentially the part of the world that was not aligned to the Soviet Union or the United States. Proxy wars were fought there for control or proxy control of natural resources. There is lots of antagonism and lots of bad blood to go around, but these hostilities that Russia sees and has interpreted have come originally from the West. If there wasn't that original antagonism of Russia hundreds of years ago, and there was a real effort made to reconcile, to make peace, and to make one with Russia for long periods of time, then we likely wouldn't be in the situation we are today, because there would not need to be a NATO, because there would not be a general European and Western antagonism to anything Russia does. So coming back to the present for a moment, with that historical context in mind, and keeping in mind, by the way, the lie that was told about NATO's expansion, you can see why Russia might want to flex its muscle a little bit here. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's going to be a World War III. The stakes are too high. Both countries, many of the countries who would be involved in this fight have nuclear weapons, and I, for one, do not want to die in a nuclear winter apocalypse. And nor do most people, for that matter. But it is very, very important that we think about, it is very important that we remember, as we listen to the speeches of our leaders and their leaders and the negotiators and all of that stuff, and all those people, that we remember that there's a long history here, that these tensions didn't come out of nowhere, that the Russia wanting to create a barrier between itself and Europe isn't new. Russia has been doing this for hundreds of years because Russia does not feel that they are safe in their position. They feel that Europe is trying to encroach on what Russia believes is theirs, and they have tried as much as possible throughout their history to make sure that there is something in the way. During the Cold War, it was the Western Bloc. Before that, it was Poland and the Baltic states, right? There was always a barrier between Russia and Europe, and that allowed Russia to feel safe in its position vis-a-vis Europe. But now, if NATO is able to get countries that are literally on Russia's doorstep to join, there is no barrier anymore between Europe and Russia, which on paper doesn't seem like a bad thing, but when you're Russia and you feel that Europe is inherently and innately hostile to you, you've just taken away kind of one of the last safety blankets that you had against what appears to be a group of nations that is continually hostile to you. And by the way, with none of this commentary am I saying that Russia or NATO or Europe or anyone is right. I'm not deciding winners and losers here. I'm not saying who's right and wrong. What I'm telling you is that Each group is very much playing towards their own particular interests. Russia is very nervous about the expansion of NATO and the EU as far as military things go. And Europe is very concerned about how Russia will act if they're not kept in check in some way, right? One of the reasons Europe wants all these nations to join NATO is because Europe is still afraid of a hostile Russia, just like Russia is afraid of a hostile Europe. And by the way, part of this is because of obviously hundreds of years of aggression, but also because they just have different and opposing interests. Some of those are economic, some of those are are social and political. But the point is, as we go forward and as this crisis unfolds, and I don't mince words here, it is a crisis and it's getting worse by the day. We also need to remember that each side has its own motivations and that this conflict is not new. It has been brewing for hundreds of years. There is still time to avoid it. There is still time to create peace. There is still time, but we have to give the opportunity for the Russian people to engage us, the West, as people, right? We need to think of them and both sides if you're not in either of those camps. I mean, I'm not in either camp personally. But we need to evaluate the situation, giving due weight and deference to each side, hearing out their arguments, understanding their motivations, and negotiating our way out of it. Because if we don't, it's going to get messy really fast.
Thanks for watching this video, guys. If you liked it, throw a like on it, share with your friends, and subscribe for more of our content. You can also find all of our videos and clips on youtube.com. Just search Let Them Eat Bread and you'll find all of our content. Alright guys, see you next time. Bye for now.